Sir, you and your companion need to leave first class immediately. The flight attendant's voice cut through the quiet cabin like something cold and final. Every head in first class turned. Sitting in seat high A was a man in a faded jacket, the kind that had seen too many winters and not enough dry cleaning. No one said a word, but the look said everything. Daniel Brooks reached into his pocket and produced his boarding pass, holding it out with a steady hand. The attendant barely glanced at it. Seconds later, a security officer appeared at the cabin door. But before the plane ever moved, a private call reached the cockpit and the captain ordered a full stop. Daniel Brooks was not the kind of man who made entrances. He moved through Pittsburgh International the way he moved through most of his life, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. He wore a jacket that had been good quality once, maybe 6 or 7 years, ago, before the cuffs started fraying and the color faded from charcoal to something closer to gray smoke. He carried one roller bag and a backpack, and beside him walked Emma, his daughter. Her small hand tucked into his with the ease of long habit. He had planned this trip for Bond months, not the work part. The work in Seattle was routine, a consulting engagement with an airline safety program that had been on his calendar since January. It was the other part he had planned carefully, the part that required him to log into his frequent flyer account at 11:30 on a Tuesday night and count his miles 3 times before he believed the number. He had enough. 2 seats in first-class round-trip Pittsburgh to Seattle. He had been saving those miles for 3 years without quite knowing what he was saving them for. And then Emma had said quietly that she wished she could sit in the front of the plane just once, where the seats were big and people brought you things, and he had made his decision that same night. He did not tell her until that morning. She had looked at the boarding passes, both of them printed on plain paper because the airline's app had been glitching, and asked him twice if he was sure. He told her he was sure. She had smiled in the careful way she sometimes smiled at good news, like she was testing whether it was real before she let herself feel it fully. That was Baggio Truc. Now, they were at the gate, and the boarding announcement for first class had just come over the speaker, and Daniel picked up the backpack and told Emma it was time. The gate agent scanned their passes without comment and waved them through. The jetway smelled like recycled air and the staleness of early morning airports, and Emma stayed close to Daniel's side as they made their way onto the plane. The flight attendant at the cabin door, a woman in her mid-30s with her dark hair pulled back, precisely glanced at their passes and directed them left toward the first-class cabin. Her name tag read Sophie Bennett. Daniel found their seats without difficulty, row 2 seats A and B, window and middle. He lifted the roller bag into the overhead bin, settled the backpack under the seat in front of him, and sat down. The seats were wide and the leather was soft, and he thought briefly that the miles had been worth it. Emma pressed her face close to the window and looked out at the tarmac. The cabin was filling steadily. Most of the passengers boarding first class had the ease of people who did this regularly. They moved without looking at seat numbers, stowed their bags in the practiced motion of long routine, settled into their seats, and opened laptops or pulled out headphones before the cabin door was even closed. Daniel watched them without judgment. He had been on hundreds of flights, himself, though never in this section of the plane. Victoria Langford boarded Moy-High minutes after Daniel. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in the precise, understated way that costs a great deal of money and is designed to look as though it doesn't. Her carry-on was a hard-sided case in matte black, and she wore the expression of someone who expected things to be in order and occasionally found that they weren't. She stopped at row 2, looked at Daniel, and looked at Emma, and something shifted very slightly in her face. Not quite a frown, but the precursor to one. Her seat was across the aisle in row 2, seat D. She sat down, crossed her legs, and took out her phone. But Daniel noticed that she did not look at her phone. She was looking at him. He did not react. He had learned over muitam years of being a man who did not fit the image people expected in certain rooms, that reacting rarely helped. He turned toward the window and said something quiet to Emma about the runway markings because she had asked. Victoria called Sophie over approximately Bond minutes later. Daniel could not hear the full exchange from where he sat, but he caught fragments enough to understand the shape of it. Something about the seats, something about whether the passenger manifest had been verified. Sophie's response was professional and carefully neutral, but she nodded more than she should have, the kind of nodding that meant she was managing rather than dismissing. Sophie walked to the front of the cabin, spoke briefly to another crew member, and then returned. She stood in the aisle beside Daniel's row and addressed him directly. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need to verify your boarding documentation before we continue." Daniel looked up at her. "You already scanned it at the door." "I understand that," Sophie said. "There's been a question raised about the booking, and I need to take a closer look." He handed her the printed boarding passes. She studied them, then kept them, and moved to the front galley. Daniel watched her go. Victoria across the aisle had returned to looking at her phone, but her posture had the quality of someone who is listening carefully to everything happening around them. Sophie came back high foot later without the passes. "Sir," she said, "I'm still having some difficulty confirming the redemption booking in our system. I'm going to ask you to step to the front of the jetway with me so we can sort this out without inconveniencing other passengers. I'll need to hold on to the passes until we've verified everything." "There's nothing to sort out," Daniel said. His voice was even. "Those are valid boarding passes for seats high A and high B. They were issued on a miles redemption booking made months ago. The confirmation number is printed on the passes." "I understand your position," Sophie said in the tone of someone who does not understand or does not want to. "But until we can fully verify, you can verify it right now," Daniel said. "Call the loyalty program desk. The booking has been confirmed 3 times, including this morning at the gate." Sophie's expression did not change. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you and your companion to come with me." The cabin had gone quiet in the way that large groups of people go quiet when they are paying close attention while pretending not to. Daniel was aware of it, the weight of it, the specific discomfort of being the subject of that kind of attention. He was also aware of Emma beside him, who had stopped looking out the window. He looked at her. Her face was very still, the way it got when she was working hard to hold something in. He recognized that expression. He had seen it before, in harder circumstances than this, and it was the thing that settled his decision more completely than any argument about seat assignments. He could fight this. He had every right to fight it. The booking was legitimate, the passes were valid, and what was happening in this cabin was not a clerical error. It was something else, something older and uglier than a database glitch. He knew it, and most of the people in this cabin knew it, and Victoria Langford across the aisle certainly knew it. But Emma was holding herself together with a discipline she should never have needed, and Daniel decided that her not falling apart in front of a cabin full of strangers was worth more than being right. He reached up and retrieved the roller bag from the overhead bin. He picked up the backpack. He told Emma, quietly, that they were going to step out for a minute, and she nodded once and stood up and took his hand, and they walked up the aisle together while the first-class cabin watched in silence. Victoria Langford turned her face back to her phone. At the front of the cabin, as Daniel was stepping into the jetway, a man in the 3rd row, heavy-set, glasses, a button-down shirt, pulled out his phone and started filming. He said nothing, just filmed. 2 other passengers did the same. Daniel did not look at any of them. He kept his hand around Emma's and kept moving forward, and the cabin door closed behind them with a soft mechanical click of something being sealed. The jetway felt different once the door was shut. Smaller, more exposed, the kind of space that makes a difficult situation feel more difficult. Sophie spoke to a ground staff member at the gate desk, a brief conversation conducted in low voices while Daniel and Emma stood to one side. Daniel set the roller bag down and crouched to Emma's level. "We didn't do anything wrong," he told her. It was the only thing that mattered to say. She looked at him with the clear, direct look she had inherited from her mother. "Then why are we out here?" He didn't have a good answer for that, not one he could give her right now. He said, "Sometimes things take longer to get sorted than they should. That's all this is." She considered this. "Are we still going to Seattle?" "Yes," he said. "We're going to Seattle." She nodded and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they waited. Inside the first-class cabin, Victoria Langford reached for the small bottle of sparkling water that Sophie had set on her tray table and took a slow sip. The seat beside her remained empty. The seat across the aisle row, 2 seats, A and B, also remained empty. She looked at them for a moment and then looked away, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has gotten what they wanted and is not entirely sure how to feel about it. The ground staff member at the gate desk was running Daniel's confirmation number through the system for the 2nd time. The first run had returned an error she now suspected was a database lag, because the second run was showing a fully confirmed miles redemption booking seats, high A via high B. Daniel Brooks, +1 companion round-trip Pittsburgh to Seattle, booked 4 months ago. She looked at the result and then looked at Sophie, who had come back out to the jetway. "It's confirmed," the gate agent said. Sophie looked at the screen. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need to check with the cabin supervisor." Daniel, standing sow fit away with his roller bag at his feet and his arm around his daughter, heard every word of that exchange. He didn't say anything. He had moved past the point where saying things felt useful. He was in a different calculation. Now the one where you weigh what is right against what will cost the people you love the least, and you make the harder choice. The boarding door was still open. The plane had not yet pushed back. And somewhere on the other side of that door, in seat high A, the seat that belonged to Daniel Brooks on a confirmed first-class booking he had spent 3 years of miles to earn the leather, was still warm. He looked at the departure board above the gate desk. The flight to Seattle was scheduled to push back in muy bon minutes. He thought about those muy bon minutes and what they might mean. And he made a decision that had nothing to do with the seat and everything to do with the girl standing beside him. He picked up the roller bag. "Come on," he said to Emma. "Let's go find somewhere to sit." They walked back up the jetway toward the gate, and the sound of the cabin muted voices, the hum of the aircraft systems, the soft closing of overhead bins faded behind them. Daniel did not look back. He focused on the end of the jetway, on the light coming through the gate windows, on the solid and reliable fact of his daughter's hand in his. He had no idea that in approximately 10 minutes, a call would be placed from the airline's operations center to the cockpit of that plane. He had no idea that the captain sitting in that cockpit, a man named Michael Reynolds, who had been flying for Hai Mui Sao years, would pick up that call and go very still. He had no idea that the name Daniel Brooks would mean something entirely different to Thomas Reynolds than it meant to Sophie Bennett or Victoria Langford or anyone else on that aircraft. He was just a man walking with his daughter toward a row of seats near a window, trying to figure out how to explain to her gently and without bitterness that the world was sometimes like this, and that it did not mean she was worth less than anyone sitting in that cabin behind them. He found 2 seats near the gate window and sat down. Emma sat beside him and looked out at the tarmac at the plane they had just been removed from at the ground crew moving equipment beneath the wings. After a long moment, she said, "Dad, do you think the seats are comfortable in first class?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "They were pretty comfortable." "Good," she said, and she leaned her head against his arm and they sat there together in the gate area while the departure clock ticked down and Daniel Brooks, who had spent his entire career keeping aircraft safe from the inside out, waited quietly to see what came next. The gate area was not crowded at this hour. A few passengers sat scattered across the rows of seats near the window, most of them absorbed in their phones or their coffee cups, indifferent to the man and the girl who had just walked back up the jetway carrying their bags. Daniel set the roller case down beside a seat facing the tarmac and sat with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees, the posture of a man who was holding himself together by keeping very still. Through the gate window, he could see the aircraft. Ground crew moved in their practiced patterns beneath the wings. A fuel truck had pulled away. The plane was close to ready, and Daniel understood in the practical part of his mind that never fully stopped working that the window for boarding was nearly closed. He was not thinking about the seat anymore. He was thinking about Seattle, about the consulting work waiting for him there, about whether he could get Emma something decent to eat in the terminal, before they figured out what flight they were actually going to be on. These were the thoughts he allowed himself. The other thoughts, the ones about what had just happened in that cabin, about the faces of the passengers who had watched him walk out, about the expression on Victoria Langford's face when she turned back to her phone, those he set aside the way he had learned to set things aside that he could not do anything useful with. Emma was looking out the window. She had not said anything since they sat down, and Daniel did not push her. He knew her silences. This one was the kind where she was processing rather than withdrawing, turning something over in her mind with the quiet, methodical approach she had gotten from him and the emotional steadiness she had gotten from her mother. At the gate desk, the agent who had run Daniel's confirmation number was still at her station. She was on the phone now, speaking in a tone too low to carry across the gate area, her eyes moving between her screen and the jetway door. Daniel noticed this without fully registering it. His attention had shifted inward. The departure board above the desk showed chin minutes to scheduled pushback. Inside the aircraft in the cockpit, Captain Thomas Reynolds was completing his pre-departure checklist when the call came through from operations. It was not a routine call. The channel it came through was used for time-sensitive administrative issues, the kind that occasionally required a captain's direct attention before departure. Reynolds picked up and identified himself, and the operations coordinator on the other end gave him a name: Daniel Brooks. Reynolds did not respond immediately. He sat down, the checklist in his hand, and looked at the instrument panel without seeing it. He knew that name. He had known that name for years, since a safety review meeting in a conference room in Dallas, where a freelance aviation engineer had presented a structural fatigue analysis that nobody in that room had wanted to hear. Reynolds had not been in that room himself. He had been consulted afterward as part of the pilot advisory group brought in during the inspection process. But the analysis had circulated widely enough that everyone in commercial aviation who paid attention knew what had happened and who had driven it. The analysis identified a stress fracture pattern in the wing spar assembly of a regional aircraft model currently in service with 4 carriers, including the one Reynolds flew for. The engineer had the data, he had the modeling, and he had the quiet certainty that is more convincing than any raised voice. The executives had pushed back hard. The engineer had not moved. 3 weeks later, the model was grounded for inspection. The fractures were confirmed in Moy-Mode aircraft. The repair program took months and cost the industry an amount that was never fully disclosed. But the number that circulated informally had 7 figures. No one had died. That was the point. No one had died because one engineer had done the work and refused to be talked out of it. Reynolds knew the name Daniel Brooks the way people in his profession knew the names of the people who had kept them alive without ever meeting them in person, with a specific and unglamorous gratitude that had nowhere obvious to go until a moment like this one. The operations coordinator was still talking. She explained that Brooks was currently a contracted independent evaluator for the airline's new safety compliance program, an engagement arranged at the executive level and kept off the standard passenger manifest notes. Brooks had boarded as a regular first-class passenger. He had been removed from the cabin approximately minutes ago, following a complaint from another passenger and a verification dispute initiated by cabin crew. Reynolds asked her to repeat the last part. She did. He set the phone down on its cradle and sat for a moment with his hands flat on his thighs. Then he pressed the intercom for the forward cabin. Sophie Bennett answered on the second tone. Reynolds asked her to confirm the status of the passenger removed from seat high A. She confirmed that the passenger and his companion were currently in the gate area, that their booking had been verified as legitimate after they had already been escorted off the aircraft, and that the situation was, in her words, being assessed by the ground supervisor. Reynolds asked her what being assessed meant in practical terms. Sophie said she was not certain. Reynolds told her he would be stepping out of the cockpit and to hold the cabin. He did not explain why. He was a Hamui Saunum captain, and he did not need to explain why. Back in the gate area, Daniel had made a decision. It had formed quietly over the past several minutes without drama, the way most of his important decisions formed through a process of elimination that left him with only one option he could live with. He was going to take Emma to the terminal, find the customer service desk, and request 2 seats on the next available flight to Seattle in whatever cabin had space. He would file a formal complaint, not because he expected anything to come of it immediately, but because the record needed to exist. And he would not tell Emma what the complaint was about or why he was filing it, because she did not need to carry that. He reached down for the roller bag handle and looked at Emma. "Ready to go find some breakfast?" Before she could answer, the jetway door opened. The man who came through it was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered in full captain's uniform, 4 stripes, the posture of someone accustomed to being the final authority in any room he entered. He looked around the gate area with the efficient scan of a man who knows exactly who he's looking for, and his eyes found Daniel within Bagay. Captain Thomas Reynolds walked across the gate area and stopped in front of Daniel Brooks and extended his hand. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Thomas Reynolds. I'm the captain of your flight." Daniel shook his hand carefully, reading the situation without yet understanding it. "Captain, I owe you an apology on behalf of this airline," Reynolds said. He was not performing the apology. His voice was level, and his eyes were direct, and he said it the way someone says something they mean. What happened in that cabin should not have happened. Your booking is confirmed. Your seats are yours, and I would like to personally escort you and your daughter back on board." Daniel looked at him for a moment. The gate agent already confirmed the booking was legitimate. "That was before we left." "I know," Reynolds said. "And you still left. That's the part I'm here about." Something in Reynolds' expression was more specific than a routine customer service correction, and Daniel, who had spent his career reading technical details that other people missed, noticed it. He did not ask about it yet. He looked at Emma, who was watching Reynolds with the careful attention she gave to adults who surprised her. "What changed?" Daniel asked. I who you are, Mr. Brooks," Reynolds said. "Not from the booking. I know your work, the wing spar analysis 7 years ago." The gate area was quiet. The departure board ticked to 7 minutes. Daniel Brooks was a man who did not show much on his face when something landed hard. This was one of those moments. He looked at Reynolds and understood what the captain was saying, and the understanding moved through him in a way that was difficult to name. Not vindication, exactly. Not relief. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. "That was my job," Daniel said. "Yes," Reynolds said. "It was. And what happened to you on that aircraft today is not how this airline treats the people who do that job or any job. I want to fix it." From inside the jetway, a ground supervisor appeared at the doorway. She was in her 30s, carrying a tablet, and her expression was that of someone managing a situation that had moved outside the lines she was trained to handle. She addressed Reynolds directly. "Captain, I need to advise that a departure delay at this stage is going to require an incident report, and I'm aware," Reynolds said without turning around. "The operations center is asking for an ETA on pushback, and they're going to need a reason for the hold if we go past. Tell them the captain is handling a passenger matter and will update them shortly." Reynolds still had not turned around. His attention remained on Daniel. The supervisor retreated to her tablet. Inside the first-class cabin, the hold was becoming noticeable. Passengers who had been settled and ready for departure were now aware that something was different. The boarding door had not closed. The crew was not in position. 2 passengers near the front were looking toward the jetway. Victoria Langford had put down her phone. The man in row 3 who had filmed Daniel's exit was still holding his phone. The camera pointed at nothing in particular now. Sophie Bennett stood at the forward galley and watched the open jetway door and felt the discomfort of someone who has made a decision that is beginning to reveal its full cost. In the gate area, Daniel had not moved from his seat. He was still holding the roller bag handle. He looked at Reynolds, and then at Emma, and then back at Reynolds. And he ran through the full calculation in a way that took less than seconds, because he had already been running pieces of it for the past several minutes. Going back meant walking back into that cabin in front of every passenger who had watched him leave. It meant sitting across the aisle from Victoria Langford for the duration of a 5-hour flight. It meant Emma spending those 5 hours in a seat she had already been told she did not belong in, surrounded by people who had watched her father be publicly questioned and escorted out. Daniel weighed all of this and found that it mattered, and he weighed it against what Reynolds was offering, which was not just a seat, but something more specific, a correction made openly by someone with the authority to make it. And he found that that mattered too. He was deciding. Victoria Langford inside the cabin was arriving at her own version of the same moment. She had been aware from the minute the hold began that things had shifted in a direction she had not anticipated. The captain coming off the aircraft was not something that happened in ordinary circumstances. The fact that he had left the cockpit minutes before pushback to go to the gate area meant that whatever was happening was not a routine passenger dispute being handled by ground staff. She looked at the open jetway door, and something cold settled in her chest that was not quite guilt and not quite fear, but was related to both. She looked at the 2 empty seats in row 2 and then looked at her phone, and this time she did not look away from it because she was listening. She looked away from it because she did not want to see the seats. At the gate, Reynolds was still waiting for Daniel's answer. Daniel stood up. He released the roller bag handle and straightened his jacket, the faded, charcoal jacket that had seen too many winters and not enough dry cleaning, and he looked at the captain of the aircraft that was waiting for him and said, "All right." Reynolds nodded once. Daniel looked at Emma. She was already on her feet, her expression carrying the same careful quality it had carried all morning, testing whether good news was real before allowing herself to feel it. Daniel picked up the roller bag and held out his other hand, and she took it. And they walked toward the jetway together for the second time that morning. The ground supervisor stepped aside. Sophie Bennett at the forward galley watched the jetway door and waited. The aircraft was 10 minutes behind schedule. The operations center was sending a follow-up inquiry to the cockpit. 3 passengers in first class had their phones out. The boarding door was still open, and Victoria Langford, in seat high day, had stopped looking at her phone entirely. She was looking at her hands, and her expression was the expression of a person who has just understood fully and without any remaining ambiguity the exact shape of the mistake they have made. They walked back through the jetway in a different order than they had left it. Reynolds went first, then Daniel, then Emma, and the ground supervisor followed at a distance with her tablet held against her chest like something she needed to protect. The jetway felt shorter going back. Daniel noticed that. He did not know if it was the direction or the company or simply the fact that this time he knew where he was going. The cabin door was still open. Sophie Bennett was standing at the forward galley, and when Reynolds stepped back onto the aircraft, she straightened in the way that crew straightens when the captain returns. Not stiffly, but with the attentiveness of someone who understands that whatever is about to happen has moved beyond their authority to manage. She looked at Daniel and then at Emma, and then at her own hands briefly before returning her eyes to Reynolds. Reynolds did not go back to the cockpit immediately. He turned to face the first-class cabin. The passengers who had been looking at their phones or staring at the headrests in front of them all shifted their attention at the same moment, drawn by the simple fact of the captain standing in the aisle facing them rather than disappearing behind the cockpit door. The man in row 3 still had his phone out. Victoria Langford, in seat high day, was looking directly at Reynolds with an expression that had lost most of its earlier certainty. Reynolds spoke clearly enough to be heard by everyone in the cabin without raising his voice. "I want to take a moment before we depart. What happened on this aircraft in the last balmy food did not meet the standard this airline holds itself to. And it did not meet my standard as the captain of this flight. He was not performing contrition, he was stating a fact. Mr. Brooks and his companion were removed from their confirmed seats based on an assumption that had no basis in the actual booking record. That was wrong, and I want to say so plainly in front of everyone who witnessed it." The cabin was completely still. Reynolds continued. "Most of you don't know who Daniel Brooks is, and that's exactly the point. It shouldn't matter. But I'm going to tell you anyway, because I think it's relevant to what happened here today." He looked at Daniel not for permission exactly, but with the consideration of a man who understands that someone else's story belongs to them. Daniel gave a short nod. Reynolds looked back at the cabin. 7 years ago, Mr. Brooks identified a structural defect in a class of regional aircraft that was in active service across multiple carriers. He documented it. He presented it to an industry that did not want to hear it, and he did not back down when he was pressured to. Mode aircraft were pulled from service. The repairs took months. No one died. That is not a small thing. No one in the cabin moved. The man in row 3 had lowered his phone slightly, though the camera was still running. Mr. Brooks is also currently engaged by this airline as an independent safety evaluator, Reynolds said. He boarded this flight as a regular passenger in seats he earned through a legitimate miles redemption. He was removed from those seats because of how he looked, not because of anything in the record. And that is something I am not willing to let stand without saying so directly. Victoria Langford was looking at the tray table in front of her. Her hands were in her lap. Reynolds stepped back and gestured toward row 2. Daniel moved past him and lifted the roller bag back into the overhead bin. The same bin, the same position, and sat down in seat high A. Emma settled into seat high B beside him. The leather was exactly as he had left it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the man in row 3 started clapping. It was not a loud clap, not a performance. It was the sound of someone doing the one concrete thing available to them to mark that a wrong had been corrected. 3 other passengers joined within high seconds, then more. Within more seconds, the entire first-class cabin was applauding. Not with the enthusiasm of an audience, but with the quality of people who had been uncomfortable witnesses to something and were grateful for the chance to register, however quietly, that they knew it had been wrong. Daniel did not stand. He did not acknowledge the applause with anything more than a brief, contained nod. He was not comfortable with it, but he let it happen because refusing it would have been its own kind of performance. And he was done performing anything for this cabin. Emma looked around at the people clapping and then looked at her father. Something had shifted in her expression. The careful measuring quality had eased, replaced by something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to matter. Daniel put his hand over hers on the armrest and left it there. Victoria Langford didn't clap. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the tray table, and after several seconds, she turned her face toward the window, away from the aisle, away from the seats across from her that were no longer empty. The cold thing that had settled in her chest during the hold hadn't left. It had gotten more specific. She was a woman who had built her professional life on the ability to assess situations quickly and act decisively, and she was now sitting with the full recognition that her assessment this morning had been wrong from the beginning. Not mistaken in a technical sense, but wrong in a way that went deeper than a database error. The applause around her was a precise measurement of exactly how wrong. Sophie Bennett at the forward galley was not applauding either. She was watching. When the applause settled, she walked to row 2 and stood in the aisle and addressed Daniel directly. Her voice was steady, though it cost her something to make it that way. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology. I didn't verify the information the way I should have. I let someone else's concern override what the record was showing me, and I held on to your boarding passes and walked you out of seats that were yours. I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. He meant it. He could see that the apology was real, that it was not a script being executed to manage a situation, and that mattered to him. "It happens," he added, and left it there because it did happen. And he was not interested in prolonging her discomfort beyond what was necessary for the thing to be acknowledged. Sophie nodded once and returned to the galley. In the operations center, the duty manager was watching the departure delay ticker and fielding calls from 2 supervisors who wanted to understand what was happening with the Seattle flight. The ground supervisor at the gate had filed a preliminary incident note that used the phrase, "passenger reinstatement following captain intervention," which had triggered a flag requiring a senior response. The duty manager made 3 calls in quick succession to the gate, to the cabin supervisor coordinator, and to the airline's VP of customer operations, who stepped out of a meeting when she saw who was calling. The conversation was brief and functional. The videos were already circulating. The man in row 3 had posted 2 clips to a platform that did not require captions to convey what was happening, and the clips had been picked up by several other accounts within Haimui minutes. The VP said she would be at the airport within Banmui minutes. The duty manager said the captain was handling the on-aircraft situation and the operational priority was getting the flight departed. The VP agreed and said the airline would be making a formal statement before the end of the business day. Back in the cabin, Reynolds had returned to the cockpit. The boarding door was sealed. The crew was in position. The operations center had cleared the updated pushback time, and the ground crew had begun the disconnect sequence for the jetway. The flight to Seattle departed Pittsburgh Banmui minutes behind schedule. Daniel spent the first hour working through a set of technical documents on his laptop, the preliminary materials. For the safety evaluation, he was scheduled to begin in Seattle the following morning. He read methodically, making occasional notes in the margins of a printed report pulled from the front pocket of the backpack. Emma had the window seat and watched the cloud cover break over western Pennsylvania, pointing out features of the landscape below with steady enthusiasm. Sophie brought the meal service to row 2 with the same professionalism she brought to every other row, but she took an extra moment when she set Daniel's tray down to make sure everything was correct, the kind of care that follows a genuine apology. He thanked her. She said, "Of course." During the second hour, Victoria Langford got up from seat high day and walked to the forward lavatory. On her way back, she stopped in the aisle beside row 2. Daniel looked up from his laptop. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression on her face was not the one she had worn when she boarded. It had lost its architecture. She looked, if anything, tired. "I behaved badly this morning," she said. She did not qualify it or explain it. She said it the way someone says something they have arrived at slowly and are not proud of. "I want you to know that I know that." Daniel looked at her for a moment. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was not performing remorse for an audience. The cabin around them was occupied with its own concerns, meals, screens, the white noise of cruising altitude, and no one appeared to be watching. She was saying this because she needed to say it, and he recognized that. "All right," he said. She nodded and returned to her seat. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a resolution in any clean narrative sense. It was simply one person telling another person the truth about themselves without requiring anything in return. And Daniel thought, as he turned back to his documents, that it was probably the most honest thing Victoria Langford had said all day. The flight landed in Seattle high minutes behind schedule. The delay partially recovered over the mountains, where the tailwind had been favorable. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Reynolds came over the intercom with the standard arrival information, local time, gate number, connecting flight guidance. And at the end of it, he added one line that was not standard. "Thank you for your patience this morning. Safe travels to all of you. And to Mr. Brooks, thank you for the work you do." The cabin was quiet for a moment after the intercom clicked off. Emma looked at her father. "He means you," she said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "He does?" She thought about this. "Because of the planes, the thing you found." Daniel had kept the details spare over the years, telling her only that his job was making sure aircraft were safe, not the full weight of what that sometimes meant. He looked at her now and decided she was ready for a little more of it. "There was a problem with the type of aircraft," he said. "A structural issue that could have been very serious. I found it before anything happened, and I made sure the right people knew about it. Did they listen the first time?" "No," Daniel said. "Not the first time, but you kept going." "Yeah," he said. "I kept going." She looked out the window at the wet tarmac at the ground crew in their yellow vests moving toward the aircraft. "Is that why the captain came off the plane for you?" Daniel thought about how to answer that accurately. "Partly," he said, "but also because what happened wasn't right, and he was in a position to do something about it." And he did. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to keep the boarding pass. The one from today?" "Both of them," she said. "The ones you printed." He reached into the backpack and found them 2 sheets of plain paper, folded once, with the confirmation number and seat assignments printed in the standard airline font. He handed them to her. She folded them carefully and put them in the front pocket of her jacket. He did not ask her why. He understood why. She was keeping them for the same reason people keep any record of a day that taught them something, not as evidence of what had gone wrong, but as proof that it had been corrected, and as a reminder that the correction had required someone to decide it was worth making. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Around them, the cabin filled with the sounds of people gathering their things, overhead bins opening, phones coming off airplane mode, the low murmur of resumed conversations. Daniel closed his laptop, zipped the backpack, and stood to retrieve the roller bag. The day after they returned to Pittsburgh, the airline announced a mandatory training update for all cabin crew focused on booking verification procedures and bias in passenger interactions. The announcement used the careful language of institutional improvement, but the incident report filed by the ground supervisor and the captain's own written account had been specific enough that everyone inside the organization understood exactly what had prompted it. Sophie Bennett completed the training in its first available session. She also submitted a written account of her own actions during the incident that went beyond what was required, a document that named her mistakes without minimizing them, and that served in the months that followed as part of the core case study material. The training program was built around. She had not done this because she was required to. She had done it because she believed the record should be accurate, and because she had learned standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin that morning that accuracy was not always the same as comfort. Victoria Langford sent a letter. It arrived at Daniel's home address in Pittsburgh weeks after the flight, handwritten on plain stationery, 2 pages. Daniel read it once and put it in a drawer. When he responded, his reply was short, a single paragraph acknowledging the letter and saying simply that he hoped she carried the lesson forward. He meant that, without bitterness. People arrived at their reckonings on different timelines, and what mattered was not the speed of the arrival, but what they did once they got there. Emma kept the boarding passes in a small box on her desk alongside other things she considered worth keeping. A photograph, a river stone, a folded note from someone who had once said something true about her. The boarding passes were not the most important thing in the box, but they were in it, and she knew exactly what they were for. Daniel Brooks went back to work. He flew as he always had in whatever seat the booking provided, through whatever weather the route required, doing the work that most people never thought about, and that made it possible for all of them to land safely. He did not think of himself as remarkable for this. He thought of it as the job, and he thought of the job as worth doing, and that had always been enough. It was still enough.